On August 20, 1945, the humidity hung thick as molasses over the temporary holding facility near Manila Bay in the Philippines. 43 Japanese civilian women sat in rigid silence on the concrete floor of what had once been a warehouse, their backs pressed against the corrugated metal wall that radiated heat like an oven. Outside, the rumble of American supply trucks echoed across the compound, carrying the sound of a war that had officially ended just 5 days earlier. The women believed they were awaiting their final judgment, expecting retribution for years of conflict that had torn the Pacific apart. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. What these women could never have anticipated was that their encounter with Private First Class Marcus Washington, a 22-year-old supply clerk from Alabama's Tuskegee region, would challenge everything they understood about their captors and fundamentally transform their perception of human dignity in the aftermath of the most devastating conflict in human history. The morning had begun like every other day since their capture 3 weeks earlier. Keiko Nakamura, a 41-year-old teacher who had been working at a school in Davao when American forces advanced through the Philippines, watched through the barred window as the sun climbed higher into an azure sky that seemed to mock their circumstances. She had been teaching Japanese language and culture to Filipino children when the evacuation order came, but like many civilians, she had been caught in the chaos of the military withdrawal. Now she found herself classified as a prisoner of war, though she had never held a weapon or worn a uniform. Beside her sat Sachiko Yamamoto, 37 years old, who had operated a small medical clinic in Mindanao with her husband before the conflict reached their remote community. Her gentle hands, which had delivered countless babies and tended to both Japanese and Filipino patients without discrimination, now trembled slightly as she folded and refolded a piece of torn cloth that served as her only personal possession. The irony was not lost on her that she, who had dedicated her life to healing, was now viewed as an enemy by those she had never harmed. The youngest among them was Misato Fujiwara, barely 19 years old, who had been visiting her uncle's plantation when the American advance began. She had never seen her homeland of Japan, having been born and raised in the Philippines, yet her ancestry alone had determined her fate. Her wide brown eyes, which still held traces of the optimism of youth despite their current circumstances, darted nervously between the other women and the heavily secured door that marked the boundary of their confined world. The facility itself told the story of rapid military advancement and equally rapid improvisation. What had once been a commercial warehouse for storing agricultural exports had been hastily converted into a detention center, with the addition of metal bars, guard posts, and basic sanitary facilities. The American military had found itself responsible for thousands of Japanese civilians scattered across the Philippine archipelago, and existing prisoner facilities were already overcrowded with military personnel captured during the final months of the Pacific Campaign. The heat inside the warehouse was becoming unbearable as the morning progressed toward noon. The metal roof, painted a dull military green, absorbed and concentrated the tropical sun until the air itself seemed to shimmer with intensity. The women had learned to remain as still as possible during the hottest hours, conserving both energy and precious bodily fluids. Their daily water ration consisted of 2 tin cups per person, delivered at dawn and dusk by rotating guards who rarely made eye contact and spoke only when absolutely necessary. Captain Robert Mitchell, the facility commander, had established strict protocols for prisoner interaction. A career officer from West Point with 15 years of service, Mitchell ran his temporary command with the efficiency and detachment that had earned him commendations during the Philippine campaign. His standing orders were clear and non-negotiable: minimal contact with prisoners, standardized meal delivery, medical attention only for emergencies, and absolute prohibition of personal conversations or unauthorized distribution of supplies. The morning inspection had been conducted by Sergeant William Davies, a tough veteran from the European theater, who had been reassigned to Pacific operations after recovering from wounds received during the advance through Germany. Davies moved through his duties with mechanical precision, checking locks, counting prisoners, and ensuring that the established routine proceeded without deviation. He viewed the Japanese women with the same professional detachment he applied to all aspects of military life, seeing them not as individuals, but as administrative responsibilities to be managed until higher command determined their ultimate disposition. But Private First Class Marcus Washington represented something entirely different within this rigid military structure. The son of sharecroppers who had struggled against the harsh realities of Depression-era Alabama, Marcus had volunteered for military service despite the discrimination he faced in civilian life. He had been assigned to the predominantly African-American supply units that formed the backbone of American logistics operations throughout the Pacific Theater, loading and unloading countless tons of equipment, food, ammunition, and medical supplies that kept the advancing forces operational. Marcus had witnessed firsthand the devastating impact of the conflict on civilian populations throughout his service in the Pacific. He had seen Filipino families displaced from their homes, children separated from their parents, and entire communities struggling to rebuild in the aftermath of military operations. Unlike many of his fellow soldiers, who maintained emotional distance from the human cost of warfare, Marcus found himself deeply affected by the suffering he observed among non-combatants caught in circumstances beyond their control. The segregation within the American military meant that Marcus and his fellow African-American soldiers often found themselves occupying a unique position within the command structure. They served their country with dedication and courage, yet faced discrimination and limited opportunities for advancement within their own forces. This experience had given Marcus a particular sensitivity to injustice and an understanding of what it meant to be judged based on circumstances of birth rather than individual character or actions. On this particular morning, Marcus had been assigned to inventory and distribute cleaning supplies throughout the various detention facilities under Captain Mitchell's command. His clipboard contained detailed lists of soap, disinfectant, and other sanitary materials that needed to be delivered to maintain health standards among the prisoner population. The work was routine and methodical, the kind of administrative duty that filled much of military life during the transition from active combat to occupation responsibilities. As Marcus approached the warehouse where the Japanese women were held, he could hear the sound of labored breathing through the metal walls. The combination of high humidity, elevated temperature, and poor ventilation was creating conditions that bordered on dangerous for the prisoners inside. He paused outside the entrance, consulting his paperwork, while simultaneously listening to the subtle sounds that indicated human distress within the building. The regulations were absolutely clear about his responsibilities and limitations. Marcus was authorized to enter the facility for the purpose of delivering supplies to the guard station, but direct interaction with prisoners was strictly forbidden without explicit authorization from a commissioned officer. Violation of these standing orders could result in disciplinary action, reduction in rank, or even court-martial proceedings that could destroy his military career and impact his post-war opportunities. However, Marcus had also witnessed the practical application of these regulations over the previous weeks. He had seen how rigid adherence to protocol sometimes created unnecessary suffering among prisoner populations, particularly when dealing with civilian detainees who posed no security threat. The Japanese women in this facility had been thoroughly searched and classified as non-combatants, yet they remained subject to the same restrictive conditions applied to captured military personnel. As he unlocked the outer door and entered the facility's administrative area, Marcus could see through the interior security gate into the main detention space. The sight that confronted him challenged his ability to maintain professional detachment. 43 women sat in various states of visible exhaustion, their clothing damp with perspiration, their movements slow and deliberate in the overwhelming heat. Several appeared to be elderly, while others seemed barely out of their teenage years, yet all shared the same expression of quiet resignation mixed with underlying fear. The guard on duty was Corporal James Peterson, a reliable soldier from Minnesota who had served with distinction throughout the Philippine campaign. Peterson had developed a reputation for following orders precisely while maintaining a reasonable degree of humanity in his interactions with both fellow soldiers and civilian populations. He acknowledged Marcus's arrival with a brief nod and returned to his paperwork, trusting that the supply delivery would proceed according to standard procedures. Marcus began his assigned tasks methodically, checking off items on his inventory list as he arranged cleaning supplies in the designated storage area. But his attention kept returning to the scene visible through the security gate. The women appeared to be rationing their own movements, speaking only in whispers, and sharing what little shade was available near the rear wall of the facility. Their behavior suggested a level of organization and mutual support that spoke to their resilience in the face of difficult circumstances. Among the women, Keiko Nakamura had emerged as an informal leader, not through any formal designation, but through the natural authority that came from her teaching experience and calm demeanor under pressure. She had organized the group to share resources equitably, ensure that the elderly and infirm received priority access to shade and the limited seating available, and maintain a schedule of quiet activities that helped pass the long hours of confinement. Keiko had also taken responsibility for interpreting the various sounds and activities outside their facility, helping her fellow prisoners understand the routine of their captors and anticipate changes in their daily schedule. She had learned to distinguish between the footsteps of different guards, the mechanical sounds that indicated meal delivery, and the administrative activities that suggested visits from higher-ranking officers. This knowledge helped reduce anxiety among the group by providing a sense of predictability in an otherwise uncertain situation. Sachiko Yamamoto had used her medical training to monitor the health of their group, identifying signs of dehydration, heat exhaustion, and other conditions that could become serious if left untreated. She had improvised treatments using available materials, creating makeshift cooling cloths from torn fabric, and developing techniques for reducing the impact of the oppressive heat. Her gentle manner and obvious competence had made her a source of comfort for the younger women who struggled with the emotional challenges of their imprisonment. Young Misato Fujiwara had become the group's informal messenger, moving quietly between different clusters of women to share information, provide encouragement, and help maintain morale. Her youth and energy made her particularly effective at lifting spirits during the most difficult periods of their confinement. She had also demonstrated a remarkable ability to remain optimistic despite their circumstances, often sharing stories and observations that helped distract her companions from their immediate discomfort. The daily routine within the warehouse had become rigidly structured as a survival mechanism. The women woke before dawn to take advantage of the coolest part of the day, sharing whispered conversations and quiet planning for the hours ahead. When breakfast arrived, consisting typically of rice, water, and occasionally vegetables, they had developed a system for ensuring equal distribution while providing additional portions for those who appeared to need extra nutrition. During the hottest midday hours, activity was reduced to an absolute minimum. The women would arrange themselves to maximize access to what little shade was available, taking turns in the cooler areas near the walls and sharing makeshift fans created from pieces of cardboard and cloth. Conversation during these periods was conducted in whispers to conserve energy, and many simply closed their eyes and tried to rest despite the uncomfortable conditions. Evenings brought a slight reduction in temperature, but also increased anxiety as the women contemplated their uncertain future. They knew that decisions about their ultimate fate were being made by military and civilian authorities far removed from their current location, but they had no information about the timeline or criteria that would determine their disposition. Some clung to hopes of eventual repatriation to Japan, while others feared they might never see their homeland again. The psychological impact of their situation was perhaps more challenging than the physical discomfort. Each woman had been forced to confront the collapse of everything she had considered normal and predictable about her life. Keiko had lost her students and her sense of purpose as an educator. Sachiko had been separated from her husband and prevented from practicing her medical calling. Misato faced an uncertain future in a world where her mixed heritage might make her unwelcome in both Japan and the Philippines. Yet despite these overwhelming challenges, the women had maintained their dignity and mutual support through small acts of kindness and consideration. They shared their limited resources without complaint, offered comfort during moments of particular distress, and worked together to maintain basic standards of cleanliness and organization within their confined space. Their behavior demonstrated a level of grace under pressure that would have impressed any objective observer. Marcus had been watching these dynamics through the security gate as he completed his assigned duties, and he found himself increasingly moved by what he witnessed. The quiet courage and mutual support displayed by these women reminded him of stories his grandmother had told about the strength of community during the most difficult periods of their family's experience in the rural South. He recognized in their behavior the same qualities of resilience and human dignity that had enabled his own people to survive and persevere through generations of adversity. The ethical dilemma facing Marcus was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. His military training and explicit orders dictated strict adherence to established protocols, but his personal values and sense of basic human compassion suggested that some flexibility might be both morally justified and practically beneficial. The women were clearly suffering from the heat and inadequate hydration, conditions that could potentially escalate into serious medical emergencies that would create additional complications for the facility administration. As Marcus completed his inventory tasks and prepared to leave the facility, he noticed that his supply truck contained several cases of fresh water that had been intended for delivery to officer quarters elsewhere in the compound. The water was surplus to immediate requirements and would normally be stored in a central depot until needed. Standard procedures would require him to transport the surplus directly to the central storage facility without making any unauthorized distributions along the way. However, Marcus also knew that military logistics often involved a certain degree of practical flexibility when dealing with emergency situations or unexpected requirements. Supply personnel were generally expected to use reasonable judgment in addressing immediate needs while maintaining overall compliance with distribution protocols. The question was whether the current situation with the Japanese women constituted the kind of emergency that would justify deviation from standard procedures. The temperature inside the warehouse had continued to rise as the sun reached its zenith, and Marcus could see that several of the women were showing visible signs of heat-related distress. Their movements had become increasingly sluggish. Their breathing appeared labored, and some were showing the telltale signs of early dehydration that could quickly escalate into more serious medical conditions. From a purely practical standpoint, providing additional water would likely prevent problems that could require medical intervention and create administrative complications for the facility command. Marcus made his decision with a combination of military pragmatism and personal moral conviction. He returned to his truck and retrieved 2 cases of fresh water, then approached Corporal Peterson at the guard station. His explanation was carefully phrased to emphasize the practical benefits of preventing medical emergencies while staying within the bounds of reasonable military judgment. Peterson, who had been observing the deteriorating conditions within the facility, recognized the wisdom of Marcus's suggestion and authorized the distribution. The moment when Marcus entered the main detention area, carrying cases of fresh water, marked a fundamental turning point in the experience of the 43 Japanese women. They had been expecting another routine inspection, or perhaps the arrival of their meager midday meal ration. Instead, they found themselves confronting something entirely unexpected, an act of voluntary kindness from someone they had been taught to regard as an enemy. Keiko Nakamura was the first to notice Marcus's entry, and her initial reaction was one of confusion rather than relief. In her experience, guards only entered the main area when there were problems to be addressed or regulations to be enforced. The sight of an American soldier carrying water toward their group triggered immediate anxiety about what this might signify for their treatment or their future. She quickly alerted the other women with subtle hand signals, and within moments the entire group was watching with tense anticipation. Marcus approached slowly and deliberately, recognizing that his presence represented a potentially threatening development from the prisoner's perspective. He set the water cases down near the center of the group and began opening them to reveal rows of clean bottles filled with fresh, cool water. His movements were careful and non-threatening, designed to communicate peaceful intentions rather than any form of authority or control. The silence in the warehouse was profound as the women processed what they were witnessing. This was not the distribution of required rations by disinterested guards following routine procedures. This was something qualitatively different, an individual choice to provide comfort and relief to people who had no power to demand or reciprocate such treatment. The implications were staggering for women who had been prepared for punishment or retribution. When Marcus spoke, his voice was gentle and respectful, addressing the group in the simple English words he hoped some might understand. "This water is for you," he said quietly, gesturing toward the bottles. "Drink as much as you need. The heat is dangerous and you need to stay hydrated." His tone carried none of the official authority or emotional distance that characterized most interactions with their guards. Instead, it conveyed simple human concern and a genuine desire to alleviate their suffering. Sachiko Yamamoto, with her medical training, was the first to understand fully what was being offered. She had been monitoring the group for signs of heat-related illness and knew that additional hydration was desperately needed, particularly for the elderly women and those who were already showing symptoms of distress. She rose slowly and moved toward the water, her actions serving as a signal to the others that this unexpected gift was genuine and safe to accept. The transformation that followed was remarkable in its quiet intensity. As the women began to drink the fresh, cool water, the physical relief was immediately apparent in their posture, their breathing, and their facial expressions. But the psychological impact was even more profound. This single act of kindness from an American soldier challenged fundamental assumptions about their captors and their own fate. It suggested the possibility of human recognition and dignity even within the context of their imprisonment. Young Misato Fujiwara found herself crying quietly as she drank, not from sadness but from the overwhelming emotional impact of unexpected kindness. She had been struggling with despair about her future and confusion about her identity, in a world that seemed to reject her based on her ancestry. The simple act of receiving water from someone who had no obligation to care about her welfare provided a powerful reminder that human goodness could transcend the artificial boundaries created by conflict and political circumstances. Marcus remained in the facility longer than his assigned duties required, ensuring that each woman had access to adequate water and observing their responses to his gesture. He was moved by their obvious gratitude, but also troubled by the realization of how much they had been suffering in silence. The contrast between their quiet dignity and their obvious physical distress reinforced his conviction that his decision had been both morally correct and practically necessary. The interaction that developed during those minutes was conducted largely without words, since language barriers prevented extensive conversation. However, the communication that occurred through gestures, facial expressions, and simple human recognition was perhaps more meaningful than any verbal exchange could have been. Marcus saw in these women the same fundamental humanity he recognized in his own family members, while the women began to perceive in him an individual rather than simply a representative of enemy military forces. When Corporal Peterson signaled that the time for the distribution was complete, Marcus gathered the empty cases and prepared to leave the facility. As he moved toward the exit, several of the women bowed in the traditional Japanese manner, expressing gratitude that transcended language barriers. Marcus nodded respectfully in return, acknowledging their thanks while maintaining the professional demeanor required by his position. The impact of this encounter extended far beyond the immediate relief provided by the additional water. For Marcus, it represented a moment of moral clarity in which he had chosen to act according to his deepest values, rather than simply following orders without consideration of their human consequences. He had risked potential disciplinary action to alleviate unnecessary suffering, and in doing so had affirmed his own humanity in the midst of circumstances that often required the suppression of individual conscience. For the Japanese women, Marcus's gesture became a source of hope and renewed faith in human decency that sustained them through the remaining weeks of their detention. Keiko Nakamura would later describe it as the moment when she began to believe that survival and eventual return to normal life were possible. Sachiko Yamamoto incorporated the memory into her understanding of healing as something that encompassed both physical and spiritual restoration. Misato Fujiwara carried the experience as evidence that kindness could emerge from the most unlikely sources and circumstances. The days following Marcus's water distribution brought subtle but significant changes to life within the warehouse facility. The women's improved physical condition from the additional hydration had an immediate positive impact on their overall health and morale. But perhaps more importantly, the psychological boost from experiencing unexpected kindness gave them renewed strength to face their uncertain future with greater resilience and optimism. Word of Marcus's action spread quietly through the detention facility, reaching other guards and administrative personnel through the informal communication networks that existed within any military installation. The responses were mixed, reflecting the complex attitudes that characterized American military personnel dealing with former enemy populations in the aftermath of the Pacific conflict. Some soldiers, particularly those who had experienced heavy combat and lost friends to Japanese military action, viewed Marcus's gesture with suspicion or disapproval. They argued that enemy civilians deserved no consideration beyond the minimum required by military regulations and international law. From their perspective, any voluntary kindness represented misplaced sympathy that failed to account for the aggressive actions of Japanese forces throughout the Pacific theater. However, other personnel, including some officers, recognized the practical wisdom of Marcus's approach. They understood that maintaining prisoner health and morale reduced administrative burdens and potential complications while supporting broader American objectives of demonstrating superior values and governance compared to their former enemies. Some had also observed that small gestures of humanity often produced more reliable cooperation than harsh treatment or intimidation. Captain Mitchell found himself in a particularly complex position when reports of the water distribution reached his office. As facility commander, he was responsible for maintaining discipline and ensuring compliance with established procedures. Marcus had technically exceeded his authorization by making an unscheduled distribution of supplies to prisoners, a violation that could warrant formal disciplinary action under a strict interpretation of regulations. However, Mitchell was also an experienced officer who understood the importance of practical judgment in military operations. The additional water had prevented potential medical emergencies that would have required resources and created administrative complications. More importantly, the gesture had improved conditions within the facility without compromising security or violating any substantive policies regarding prisoner treatment. From a purely practical standpoint, Marcus's decision had produced beneficial results that supported the facility's overall mission. After consulting with his superiors and reviewing relevant regulations, Captain Mitchell chose to address the situation through informal channels rather than formal disciplinary proceedings. He summoned Marcus to his office for a private conversation that emphasized both the importance of following established procedures and the value of exercising sound judgment in unusual circumstances. The result was a mild reprimand that went no further than Marcus's immediate personnel file and had no impact on his military career or future assignments. More significantly, Captain Mitchell used the incident as an opportunity to review and slightly modify facility procedures to allow for greater flexibility in addressing prisoner welfare concerns. While maintaining strict security protocols and clear lines of authority, the new guidelines provided broader discretion for personnel to respond to obvious health and safety issues without requiring extensive approval processes. This change benefited not only the Japanese women, but other prisoner populations under the facility's administration. The modification of procedures reflected broader changes in American policy toward Japanese civilian populations as the occupation of Japan began in earnest. Initial approaches that emphasized strict control and minimal interaction were gradually replaced by more sophisticated strategies designed to promote democratic values and win support for American governance objectives. Small-scale demonstrations of American fairness and humanity, like Marcus's water distribution, were increasingly recognized as valuable tools for achieving long-term political goals. Within the warehouse, the women had organized themselves to make the most effective use of the additional water Marcus had provided. Sachiko Yamamoto established a rationing system that ensured the supply would last several days, while providing adequate hydration for all group members. More importantly, she used the distribution as an opportunity to educate the younger women about recognizing and preventing heat-related illness, skills that would prove valuable throughout their remaining time in detention. Keiko Nakamura incorporated the experience into her informal role as group counselor and strategist, helping others process the complex emotions generated by receiving kindness from someone they had been taught to regard as an enemy. She encouraged the women to view Marcus's gesture as evidence that individual Americans might be different from the propaganda images they had encountered during the conflict, opening possibilities for more positive interactions during whatever trials lay ahead. The psychological impact of the encounter continued to resonate through the group dynamics within the facility. The women found themselves discussing not just the immediate relief provided by the water, but the broader implications of what Marcus's choice revealed about human nature and the possibility of reconciliation between former enemies. These conversations became a source of intellectual and spiritual sustenance that helped counteract the demoralizing effects of prolonged confinement. Young Misato Fujiwara emerged as a particular beneficiary of the renewed optimism that followed Marcus's visit. Her struggles with identity and belonging, complicated by her mixed heritage and uncertain future, were eased by the realization that individual character and actions mattered more than ancestry or political circumstances. She began to envision a post-war world where people might be judged by their behavior rather than their racial or national background. The broader American military community gradually became aware of the positive results achieved through Marcus's initiative, leading to informal discussions about optimal approaches to prisoner management and civilian relations. While official policy remained unchanged, individual commanders began exercising greater flexibility in implementing regulations when doing so could produce beneficial results without compromising essential objectives. These developments reflected the complex challenges facing American forces as they transitioned from combat operations to occupation duties throughout the Pacific region. Military personnel who had been trained and motivated to defeat enemy forces now found themselves responsible for governing and ultimately rebuilding the societies they had conquered. Success in this new mission required different skills and attitudes, including the ability to recognize shared humanity with former enemies. Marcus himself continued his regular duties within the supply system, but his experience with the Japanese women had a lasting impact on his understanding of military service and personal responsibility. He began to see his role not simply as following orders, but as contributing to broader American objectives of demonstrating superior values and governance. This perspective would influence his approach to similar situations throughout his remaining service in the Pacific Theater. The routine within the warehouse facility settled into a new pattern that reflected both the continuing restrictions of detention and the subtle improvements that had resulted from increased attention to prisoner welfare. The women maintained their disciplined approach to sharing resources and supporting one another, but with greater confidence that their basic needs would be met and that they might eventually receive fair treatment from their captors. 3 weeks after Marcus's water distribution, significant news reached the facility that would ultimately determine the fate of all Japanese civilians in American custody. Decisions had been made at the highest levels of government regarding repatriation procedures and timelines for returning non-combatant prisoners to Japan. The process would be complex and lengthy, involving extensive documentation, medical examinations, and coordination with Japanese authorities, but it represented a definitive commitment to eventual release and return home. Captain Mitchell announced the new policy during a formal assembly of all facility personnel and prisoners, using interpreters to ensure that the Japanese women fully understood what was being communicated. The repatriation process would begin within 60 days and would be conducted according to international protocols designed to ensure humane treatment and efficient processing. While many details remained to be worked out, the announcement provided the certainty about their future that the women had desperately needed. The news generated complex emotional responses among the 43 women in the warehouse. Relief at the prospect of eventual freedom was mixed with anxiety about what they might find upon returning to a Japan that had been devastated by years of conflict. Many had family members whose fate remained unknown, and all faced the challenge of rebuilding their lives in a homeland that would be fundamentally changed by defeat and occupation. Keiko Nakamura found herself reflecting on how much her own perspective had changed during the weeks of detention. Her initial fear and resentment toward her captors had been complicated by encounters with individuals like Marcus, who demonstrated that enemies could also be sources of unexpected kindness. This realization would influence her approach to teaching and community leadership when she eventually returned to civilian life in Japan. Sachiko Yamamoto began planning how she might resume her medical practice in a post-war environment, recognizing that her experiences during detention had given her new insights into the healing power of simple human compassion. She hoped to incorporate these lessons into her future work, treating not just physical ailments, but the deeper emotional and spiritual wounds created by years of conflict and displacement. Young Misato Fujiwara faced perhaps the most complex decisions about her future, since her mixed heritage and birth in the Philippines created uncertainty about where she truly belonged. However, her experience of receiving kindness from Marcus had convinced her that individual character mattered more than ancestry, giving her confidence that she could build a meaningful life regardless of how others might categorize her background. The actual repatriation process began 2 months later, with the arrival of transport ships designated specifically for returning Japanese civilians to their homeland. The logistics were staggering, involving thousands of people scattered across dozens of detention facilities throughout the Pacific region. American military personnel had developed detailed procedures for medical screening, documentation verification, and secure transport that would ensure safe passage while maintaining appropriate security measures. On the morning of their departure, Marcus was assigned to assist with the loading procedures at the Manila Bay port facility. As the 43 women from the warehouse were processed through the departure checkpoint, several recognized him among the American personnel supervising the operation. Their expressions of gratitude, conveyed through bows and smiles despite language barriers, provided Marcus with profound satisfaction about his decision to share water on that sweltering day weeks earlier. The transport ship that carried the women back to Japan represented a new chapter in their lives, but also the completion of a cycle that had begun with displacement and imprisonment. As the Philippine coastline disappeared behind them, many of the women found themselves thinking not just about the loved ones they hoped to find in Japan, but about the unexpected lessons they had learned about human nature during their time in American custody. The voyage to Japan took 8 days, providing the women with an opportunity to process their experiences and prepare psychologically for whatever awaited them in their homeland. Keiko Nakamura organized informal discussion groups that helped participants work through complex emotions about their captivity, their treatment by American forces, and their expectations for the future. These conversations became a valuable form of group therapy that helped ease the transition from imprisonment to freedom. Upon arrival in Japan, the women were processed through repatriation centers established by American occupation authorities working in cooperation with Japanese officials. The procedures were designed to provide medical care, temporary housing, and assistance in locating family members while documenting individual experiences for historical and administrative purposes. Many of the women were surprised by the respectful treatment they received from American personnel, recognizing similarities to the kindness Marcus had shown them months earlier. The long-term impact of their experiences in American custody varied among the 43 women, but several common themes emerged as they rebuilt their lives in post-war Japan. Many reported that their encounters with individual Americans who demonstrated kindness and respect had challenged their preconceptions about enemy populations and contributed to their acceptance of democratic reforms introduced during the occupation period. Keiko Nakamura resumed her teaching career with a new emphasis on international understanding and the importance of recognizing shared humanity across cultural and political boundaries. She frequently shared stories about her detention experience with students and colleagues, emphasizing how individual acts of kindness could transcend the artificial divisions created by conflict and prejudice. Her approach to education reflected her conviction that future wars could be prevented through better understanding between peoples. Sachiko Yamamoto established a new medical practice that specifically served displaced persons and others dealing with the aftermath of the conflict. Her experiences during detention had taught her about the healing power of simple compassion, lessons she incorporated into her treatment of patients suffering from both physical ailments and emotional trauma. She often credited Marcus's gesture of sharing water as a turning point in her own understanding of medical care as encompassing both body and spirit. Misato Fujiwara chose to remain in Japan despite her complex heritage, eventually becoming involved in efforts to promote reconciliation between Japan and the United States. Her experiences during detention had convinced her that individual character mattered more than ancestry, a perspective that guided her work in building bridges between former enemies. She frequently spoke about the transformative power of small acts of kindness in overcoming prejudice and mistrust. Marcus Washington completed his military service in the Pacific and returned to Alabama with a profound appreciation for the power of individual moral choices to create positive change even within restrictive institutional frameworks. His experience with the Japanese women had reinforced his conviction that treating all people with dignity and respect was both a personal responsibility and a practical strategy for achieving broader social objectives. After his military discharge, Marcus used the educational benefits available to veterans to attend college, eventually becoming a teacher in the same rural Alabama community where he had grown up. His approach to education was deeply influenced by his military experiences, particularly his recognition that small gestures of kindness could have profound and lasting impacts on individual lives. He often shared stories about his service with students, emphasizing themes of moral courage and the importance of treating all people with dignity, regardless of their background or circumstances. The broader historical significance of interactions like the one between Marcus and the Japanese women became clearer as scholars began studying the occupation of Japan and its role in establishing a lasting peace between former enemies. The success of American policies in Japan was attributed not just to major political and economic reforms, but to countless individual encounters that demonstrated American values and convinced Japanese civilians that cooperation was both possible and beneficial. Military historians noted that the relatively smooth transition from combat to occupation duties in the Pacific Theater was facilitated by policies that encouraged humanitarian treatment of civilian populations while maintaining necessary security measures. The flexibility shown by commanders like Captain Mitchell in responding to unusual circumstances contributed to overall success by reducing tensions and building trust between occupying forces and local populations. The story of Marcus's water distribution became part of the historical record through interviews conducted decades later with surviving participants. These oral history projects, designed to preserve personal experiences of the war and its aftermath, revealed the profound impact that small acts of kindness could have on individual lives and broader historical processes. The accounts provided by Keiko Nakamura, Sachiko Yamamoto, and Misato Fujiwara contributed to a more complete understanding of how personal relationships between former enemies contributed to lasting peace. Academic studies of prisoner treatment during the Pacific conflict identified the approach taken at facilities like Captain Mitchell's as particularly effective in achieving both immediate administrative objectives and longer-term political goals. The balance between security requirements and humanitarian concerns, exemplified by the tolerance shown for Marcus's initiative, became a model for future military operations involving civilian populations. The psychological research conducted on repatriated Japanese civilians revealed interesting patterns in how individual experiences shaped post-war attitudes toward the United States and democratic reforms. Women who reported positive interactions with American personnel, including seemingly minor gestures of kindness, were significantly more likely to support cooperation with occupation authorities and to embrace changes in Japanese society. These findings reinforce the strategic value of treating former enemies with dignity and respect. Educational institutions in both Japan and the United States began incorporating stories like Marcus's water distribution into curricula designed to teach students about conflict resolution and the importance of individual moral courage. The account became particularly popular in programs focused on developing leadership skills and ethical decision-making, since it illustrated how personal choices could create positive outcomes, even within restrictive institutional frameworks. International organizations involved in establishing protocols for prisoner treatment and civilian protection cited the American approach in the Pacific as a model for balancing security requirements with humanitarian obligations. The flexibility shown by commanders in responding to unusual circumstances, combined with clear guidelines for maintaining essential standards, became a template for future operations involving displaced populations and former enemy civilians. The friendship that developed between Marcus Washington and several of the Japanese women he had helped continued through correspondence that lasted for decades after the war. These letters, preserved in various archives, provide unique insights into how personal relationships between former enemies evolved over time and contributed to mutual understanding between cultures that had been in conflict. Keiko Nakamura's letters to Marcus described her work as an educator in post-war Japan and her efforts to promote international understanding through teaching. She frequently credited their encounter during her detention as a turning point in her thinking about American society and the possibility of friendship between peoples who had once been enemies. Her correspondence revealed how a single act of kindness had influenced her entire approach to education and community leadership. Sachiko Yamamoto wrote to Marcus about her medical practice and her incorporation of compassionate care principles that she traced back to his gesture of sharing water during her darkest period. Her letters described how the memory of his kindness had inspired her own efforts to heal not just physical ailments, but the emotional and spiritual wounds created by years of conflict. She viewed their brief encounter as a lesson in the healing power of simple human recognition and care. Misato Fujiwara's correspondence with Marcus chronicled her work in promoting reconciliation between Japan and the United States through various cultural and educational programs. She often reflected on how his demonstration of kindness during her detention had convinced her that individual character transcended racial and national boundaries, a conviction that guided her efforts to build bridges between former enemies. Marcus's responses to these letters revealed his own continuing reflection on the choices he had made during his military service and their lasting impact on both his own life and the lives of others. He frequently expressed amazement at how a simple decision to share water had created relationships and influences that extended far beyond anything he could have imagined at the time. His correspondence demonstrated his deep satisfaction in knowing that his choice to act according to his values had contributed to positive outcomes for people whose lives had intersected with his during one of the most challenging periods in modern history. The documentary evidence provided by these letters contributed significantly to historical understanding of how personal relationships between former enemies evolved during the post-war period and influenced broader patterns of reconciliation between Japan and the United States. Scholars noted that the themes expressed in this correspondence were echoed in thousands of similar relationships that developed between American personnel and Japanese civilians during the occupation period. The educational impact of Marcus's story extended beyond formal academic settings to influence training programs for military personnel, aid workers, and other professionals who might find themselves in positions requiring interaction with displaced or detained populations. The account became a case study in how individual moral courage could create positive outcomes while operating within restrictive institutional frameworks, providing practical guidance for others facing similar ethical dilemmas. Veterans organizations in both the United States and Japan began using Marcus's story as an example of how former enemies could develop mutual respect and understanding through personal encounters that revealed shared humanity beneath surface differences. These presentations were particularly effective in helping younger generations understand how individual choices during times of conflict could contribute to lasting peace between nations. The broader legacy of Marcus Washington's decision to share water with 43 Japanese women on that sweltering day in the Philippines extends far beyond the immediate relief it provided to people suffering from heat and dehydration. It represents a powerful demonstration of how individual moral courage can create positive change even within restrictive circumstances, and how small acts of kindness can have profound and lasting impacts on both personal lives and historical processes. The transformation experienced by the Japanese women through this encounter illustrates the power of unexpected kindness to challenge assumptions, restore faith in human goodness, and provide hope during the darkest periods of human experience. Their subsequent lives and contributions to post-war reconciliation demonstrate how positive experiences with former enemies can influence entire communities and contribute to lasting peace between nations. The courage demonstrated by Marcus in choosing to act according to his values, rather than simply following orders, provides a model for individual moral leadership that remains relevant across cultures and throughout time. His recognition that treating all people with dignity and respect was both a personal responsibility and a practical strategy for achieving positive outcomes offers guidance for anyone facing ethical dilemmas within institutional settings. The flexibility shown by military leaders like Captain Mitchell in responding to unusual circumstances while maintaining essential standards illustrates the importance of practical wisdom in implementing policies and regulations. Their recognition that small gestures of humanity could support broader objectives without compromising essential requirements provides a model for leadership that balances competing demands while achieving optimal outcomes. The lasting friendships that developed between Marcus and several of the women he helped demonstrate the potential for personal relationships to transcend the artificial boundaries created by political conflict and cultural differences. Their decades of correspondence provide evidence that individual acts of kindness can create bonds that influence entire lifetimes and contribute to mutual understanding between peoples with very different backgrounds and experiences. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.